welcome to the AfterAthena podcast, People Matters. I'm Jade McEvoy, HR consultant at AfterAthena, and I'm joined by my colleague Kimberley, who's a partner at also AfterAthena. Today we're going to be talking about grievances in the workplace, something I'm sure everyone can relate to. Grievances have multiple layers in terms of how people are perceiving different forms of communication, how they can escalate, and also how we deal with them as well. So, and I think, Kimberley, it'd be a good place to start would be to start with what is a grievance? How do we summarise what a grievance is?
Yeah, well, I mean, we can go to the ACAS code in terms of like a formal definition, which sets out any concern, problem, or complaint. But the reality is that any sort of issue raised by employees with the employer has the potential to amount to a grievance, and they can take so many different forms. They can be verbal, they can be set out in writing, sometimes in a resignation letter, even. So often the first task can be to identify whether it is actually a grievance, and sometimes even is it whistleblowing, because there can be a distinction there as well in terms of, for example, whistleblowing if it's about the organisation more than the individual, or there's an allegation that there's some sort of systemic failure by the company, then it may fall into the whistleblowing category rather than a grievance. But if it's about the individual in the main and it's a complaint or a concern, it's highly likely going to amount to a grievance. And as I say, they can take many forms in terms of, when I've spoken to clients, they can range from a grievance because an employee was asked, or rather told, how to make chicken goujons on one end of the spectrum, all the way to the other where there's been sexual harassment and everything in between.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because it's not always glaringly obvious, is it? When we've got a grievance, quite often it can be an undertone of somebody's perhaps unhappy, somebody might be acting out of character, they might be a bit withdrawn. And I think from my perspective with my HR hat on, it's management, HR, um, understanding when that's happening and being able to spot the signs, because we don't always get it neatly presented and this is a formal grievance and
No.
these are my areas of concern. And sometimes it can be quite subtle, but that doesn't take away the potential for it to escalate, or certainly how the person is feeling, does it?
No, and I think you raise a good point there in terms of when you reference before it escalates, because actually 9 times out of 10, when a grievance gets presented in a formal fashion, it's almost a bit of a last straw from the employee's perspective. And actually, when you track back and look over the past, couple of months or even years, there have been potentially telltale signs in terms of maybe, like you say, a change in behaviour or a personality clash or breakdown, which actually, if nipped in the bud, might never have actually evolved into a formal grievance in the first place.
Yeah. And I've just been made aware of a case actually where there have been rumblings and there have been a few emails, but unfortunately, management hadn't responded to it as though it was a grievance. This has happened 6 months ago, and then lo and behold, we've got a big grievance that really could have been avoided because they haven't spotted the signs that this person's not necessarily happy, and they haven't done anything with it in terms of trying to rectify the issues for that individual. But you mentioned personality clashes in communication there. We're seeing a lot more now with neurodivergent employees, aren't we, raising grievances? And I think whilst we're hearing more about it, um, the businesses need to be more aware of how people communicate differently and not sort of seeing these individuals as causing trouble unnecessarily, because quite often it is that people are perceiving things so differently, and that could be linked to whether it's neurodivergence or other medical conditions such as anxiety disorders and things like that. So I think it's really important to be aware of some of those attributes that come with those different conditions. Have you seen yourself a lot more?
I think, well, I do have, and I think I'm nodding because for me, we do see that quite a bit. And my observations are that sometimes the managers don't have the skills. So we see it quite often where a manager's being promoted because operationally they're brilliant at what they do, or technically very good, but and then promoted into a managerial position, but don't necessarily have those skills, which are completely different in terms of, communication, etc. And what we often see is that they might not have the skills or even the awareness, especially with neurodivergent employees. I know that generally speaking, we are more aware in the workplace, but I'm not sure that's filtered down quite to manager level training in terms of understanding how, as you mentioned, an employee might perceive a certain comment or a certain instruction. And, some individuals or some businesses might be, well, does that mean that we have to approach things completely differently for every individual that we speak to? And I think that's perhaps a cynical way of looking at it. It's about getting the most out of our people. And actually, if it's a small tweak to the way we convey a message or the way we pass on an instruction, then surely that's beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, agreed. And I do think, I know myself when I've dealt with quite a few cases of grievances raised by neurodivergent individuals, it definitely does help if we understand why they might be approaching it in a certain way. And I've had to do that to make accommodations for the grievance process to make it easier for the individual. For instance, I had an individual that had ADHD, and I know that some people with ADHD can hyper focus and have a tendency to send lots and lots of information. So to facilitate being able to streamline that information, so for them to be able to send the relevant information in that related to each point, and therefore enable me to investigate each point, I made a spreadsheet, and they said that that really helped them. So that's because I've taken the time to understand that that might help. And it's not to say that it would help every neurodivergent individual, but I think just understanding some of the reasons as to why somebody might be presenting in a certain way, such as a spreadsheet to enable them to submit their evidence, can really help. Whereas if I hadn't have done that, I might have just got loads of information and thought this is really irrelevant. They're being deliberately obstructive, sending me on a wild goose chase. I'm never going to be able to investigate the point that they want me to be able to investigate. But actually, they really appreciated me taking that time to understand.
And I think some employers do approach grievances, from my experience, in different ways. So you have one, I suppose, camp where employers take them incredibly seriously and they find, when the grievances are raised, is it a reflection, they're kind of challenging themselves, is it a reflection of our culture that these issues have been raised? But then the reality is that there are some organisations that will see it as a time hoover. So there might, have you come across resistance in terms of perhaps an employee think, well, is that necessary? Because there's a distinct difference from a legal perspective, having to make a reasonable adjustment in terms of a legal obligation and working collaboratively to get to an end result.
Yeah, this is it. I mean, ultimately, we needed to get an end result, whether it's upheld or not, or partially upheld, for the individual and for the client. And so ultimately, me taking a bit of extra time to facilitate the employee being able to do that, or whoever's acting as the grievance hearing manager in that scenario, is going to make it easier
Yeah.
in the long run.
And then in terms of mentioned before about before things become a formal
Mm.
grievance, what's from a HR perspective, are there any things that employers could be doing in terms of kind of focusing on that, or ensuring that they put themselves in the best position possible not to get to that formal grievance? Because that's not always possible. But
No.
are there things that they could be doing proactively?
Yeah, I think definitely in looking at it from a HR angle, from a strategic point of view, in trying to obviously prevent as many grievances as possible, I think have your regular one-to-one meetings, I think is really important, and that people feel that you have got that open door policy. So yes, have structured one-to-ones, but
Chat.